Is Russia going to invade Ukraine? What exactly does President Putin want? And why does Russia care so much about Ukraine in the first place? Right now, Russian forces have been building up near the border. Analysts say that they're seeing intel that shows Russia is preparing for a military offensive, potentially within weeks. Russia says that it doesn't actually want to invade Ukraine, and that its troop movements are actually defensive, something that a number of European countries aren't buying.
We are convinced that Russia is actually preparing for the all-out war.
So, why would Russia even want to invade Ukraine and start a war? There are a couple of reasons. The first is national identity. Ukraine and Russia have a lot of shared history. Before 1991, both were a part of the USSR, or Soviet Union. While Russia was the dominant force within the Soviet Union, Ukraine held a lot of importance both strategically and culturally. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, what we now know as modern-day Russia rose from the ashes, and a number of republics that were a part of the Union, like Ukraine, gained independence. The thing is, many Russians, including the top Russian himself, President Vladimir Putin, still consider some of these former Soviet states to be Russian. And Putin has repeatedly said he believes the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy.
Putin has always felt that Ukraine is part of Russia. You know, Ukraine should not be an independent sovereign state.
Ведь мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ. Киев – мать городов русских. Древняя Русь – это наш общий исток. Мы все равно не сможем друг без друга.
Now, there are a number of people living in Ukraine that identify as Russian. However, polling has shown that the majority of the country identifies as Ukrainian and is keen to see Ukraine remain independent from Russia. All of this isn't just about national identity though. Ukraine also holds a lot of strategic importance. It has access to the Black Sea, significant natural resources, and important trade routes. Plus, it's somewhere where Russia would like to have military bases. When you zoom out a bit, Ukraine represents a bit of a buffer between Russia and Europe, or more importantly, Russia and members of NATO. NATO is a military alliance that doesn't share the rosiest of relationships with Russia. And by that, I mean in the past, Russia has called NATO its biggest military threat. NATO denies this and says it's a purely defensive organisation. Basically, when you're a NATO member, an attack on one is an attack on all. This is designed to keep NATO members safe from invasion. But Ukraine is not a member of NATO, even though in the past it has said that it would like to be. Russia, on multiple occasions, has pressured NATO to not give Ukraine membership.
Its view has been that NATO must not, under any circumstances, admit Ukraine, that it shouldn't station permanent troops or equipment in Ukraine, and basically wants to make sure that Ukraine is part of its sphere of influence.
NATO's chief has publicly rejected Russia's demands to deny Ukraine entry.
We cannot accept that Russia is trying to re-establish a system where big powers like Russia has spheres of influence.
But if Ukraine was to become a member, there are genuine worries that Russia would respond aggressively, whether that be economically or militarily. For example, Germany, one of the biggest members of NATO, gets a significant chunk of its natural gas from Russia.
Germany is 37% dependent on Russian gas, and if the Russians turn off the tap, then that means not just German business suffers significantly in German industry, but it means people freeze in winter.
Now, time for the big question. Is an invasion actually likely? Let's start with some of the reasons why an invasion may happen. The first is that Russia has invaded Ukraine before. In 2014, Ukraine's president, who was accused of being pro-Russia and anti-European Union, was kicked out during the Ukraine Revolution. Shortly after the revolution kicked off, Russian forces invaded Ukraine and took control of two different areas. At first Crimea and eventually parts of the east. Both of these areas are known to be, compared to other parts of Ukraine, home to more ethnic Russians or Ukrainians that are sympathetic to Russia.
Russia I think, saw an opportunity, or at least was concerned, that a pro-Western government would shut out its access to the Crimean Peninsula. It launched very quickly a set of cyber attacks, a whole bunch of disinformation, and then sent in what they referred to as the friendly green men. These were heavily armed people without any sort of unit insignia, who quite quickly took over Sevastopol and Simferopol, the main cities in Crimea. Russian control over the peninsula was complete within a couple of days.
At first, Russia denied it had any involvement and said that the forces that had taken control of Crimea weren't theirs.
It was, oh no, these have nothing to do with Russia whatsoever. And then it was, well, you know, they might be irregular forces with ties to Russia. And then it was, yes, they're ours.
There was a lot of international backlash, and Russia was hit with some pretty heavy economic sanctions. But no outside countries physically stepped in to stop it happening. And fighting between competing factions, particularly in the east, has continued to this day.
He's been conducting this not quite covert war in Ukraine since April of 2014 in order to change the country's national security policy. He's failed with that. That's why he's now threatening a major invasion.
Russia maintains that what happened wasn't an invasion, but simply locals trying to restore the Russia of old.
In terms of the broader conflict in the Donbass, Russia's been fairly keen to say these are Ukrainians fighting for, you know, or if not Ukrainians, ethnic Russians fighting for a broader Russia, Novorossiya, this idea of a sort of bigger Russia that dates back to Catherine the Great.
Fast forward to today, and Ukraine's army is a lot stronger than it was in 2014. But most experts universally agree that it's still no match for Russia's military. Plus, you have a country like the United States saying that it won't be sending in troops even if an invasion happens.
That is not on the table.
Despite all of this, there are many experts that still believe an invasion probably won't happen.
The chances are serious, but far from a likelihood. It's certainly not more than 25% in my judgment, and maybe as low as 15%.
World leaders have warned Russia it will face massive political and economic sanctions if it goes ahead with an invasion.
If he moves on Ukraine, the economic consequences for his economy are going to be devastating.
Instead, many experts reckon this is less about planning an actual invasion and more about pressuring world leaders to give Russia more of a say on the future of Ukraine.
If Putin really wanted to invade Ukraine, he probably could have done so by now.
He's trying to intimidate the West and Ukraine into giving him something of value.
Simply the threat of an invasion might be enough to keep NATO out and pressure Ukraine into letting go of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Just quickly, it's important to note that while Russia is quick to point to NATO as the reason for it feeling insecure about Ukraine, there are questions about whether all of this, specifically keeping NATO out of Ukraine and pushing for independence in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, is just part of an attempt by Putin to recreate the Soviet Union in another form.
Putin has on numerous occasions used this term Novorossiya, new Russia, supposedly autonomous, in inverted commas, and independent, in inverted commas, regions of the world, over which, there would be absolutely no doubt where the control was coming from.
A big problem for NATO and the US in all of this is that if they give in to too many of Russia's demands, confidence in both of these powers could take a big hit on the international stage. For example, the Baltic nations, which are part of NATO but are also former Soviet states like Ukraine, may feel less confident that they'll be safe from Russia if it ever decides that it wants to reunify.
Central and Eastern Europe are still include generations that remember very well Soviet occupation. So the threat of an invasion by Russia is something they take very seriously. And when they see a massing of this kind of force against Ukraine, it has to make them shudder.
Overall, it's a very complicated diplomatic dance with a lot of moving parts. Right now, the Russian and Ukrainian president are both in talks with world leaders, trying to figure out a solution to this very delicate situation that currently hangs in the balance. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and also check out the International Politics playlist on our homepage.